In this example, we are going to follow along with the case structure. Now, this is located on 48 in your textbook. A case structure is essentially a more compact way of representing a nested linear if statement. So there's a couple of things that are important here. The important things to note are that a case structure is something that is supported in other high order compile time languages. So a case structure has a definite analog, so there's a counterpart to it in C++, in JavaScript, in Java, in C#, etc. So this certainly is something you are going to see represented. And secondly, it's nice to use a case structure because it is much more compact than is a nested linear if. So just to demonstrate, I've created for you a nested linear if here. This particular program, as stated on line number 2, will take a month as an input from the user, and it will display its season. Now, we live in the Midwest. I understand we only have 2 seasons, brutal winter and ridiculously hot. But once upon a time, there actually were 4 seasons. For those of you who have never witnessed 4 seasons, those are winter, spring, summer, and fall. So this module, the module called Season Finder, is going to do that. So first and foremost, on line number 7, again, we want to, with good user-facing design, we want to let the user know what our program is doing. So we're going to display to the user, enter a month, and we'll tell you the season. Next, we're going to prompt for the user to enter a month. That's on line number 8. And then line number 9, we're going to get a month. So this structure here, from 11 all the way down to 59, is our nested linear if structure, right? We go right down through the months. On line 11, it's January. On line 14, it's February. On line 17, March, so on and so forth. Each one of these decisions, we are setting a variable called season to whatever it is that the season corresponds to. So here in January, we are setting season to winter. Here in February, also winter. But here in March, on line 18, that corresponds to spring. And all the way down through, right? So we have each one of our 12 months represented between here and here. So lines, 11 and 44. But do remember that we want to have an additional else case. We want to be able to support what happens, or we want to be able to direct the user at a correct input just in case they enter Smarch, which again is in fact not one of the 12 months in the year. So here that is on line 46. Please enter a month of the year, January through December, just in case they have entered something incorrect. Other things to note here, again, for every if, we have an else on the same vertical line, like so, and we have an end if on that vertical line. Here in Sublime Text, you can see if, else, and down here are end if. Right here next to my cursor, you'll see on the left-hand side, you'll see that gray bar that lets the user see, that's you guys, that lets you see as you're developing, okay, if I need an if, an else, and an end if on the same vertical line, this is the vertical line that we're going to have for that. You'll notice though, this gets really complicated really quickly, right? I mean, look at how far over we're going. So that means that by the time we're on line number 41 here, we are 12 indents deep into our nested linear structure. What happens if we have state codes, for example? If we were doing mailing codes for the United States, we would have better than 54 of them. That means better than 54 indents of text on the way out. That's too much. What we need is another structure to be able to show us in shorthand how to represent this accurately and logically, but to do it in a way that we can see much more clearly. And that is actually what we use the case structure for. So what we are going to rely on is the case structure to replace all of this logic here from 11 down to 61. So if you do the math on this, 11 to 61 means that we have 50 lines of code in between here and there. So what I'm going to do is replace that with a case structure. And as you can tell, I have considerably less text here to have to worry about. So let's just clean this up so we can accurately represent how many lines of text this is really going to be. Our entire module starts on 4 and it ends on line 28. In total, this is 24 lines of code versus the 50 plus lines of code that this example of that module was. From 5 to 64 means this was 59 lines of code versus 24 lines of code. That is a huge reduction in the amount of space it takes for the next developer in the chain to look at your code and figure out exactly what's happening there. So, what are the parts of the case structure that we have to be aware of? Right here, the case structure begins on line number 10. Case of in all uppercase, because this again is our keyword, and the keyword lets the next developer in the chain know what kind of logical structure it is that they are going to need to develop here. So case of. You'll also notice down here on line 24, we have the end case. That is how we know that the case structure is finished with its piece of logic. After the case of, we have a colon here. It is not a semicolon, it is a full colon. And after that is the name of the variable that we are going to check against. So this is a simple check against a variable. We do not use a case structure when we have to do math. We only do case structures when we have simple linear selection to have to do. So month. This on line number 12, so January, that's the kind of input that we have for month there. Now, one thing to note is, and I wanted to add these later, is in the case structure, whatever the user is entering, we do need to have them inside of single quotes. So that was me placing single quotes here in each one of my possible text entries for what the month of the year was. Now remember, from a previous supplement, there is a difference between a double quote and a single quote. A single quote, like we see here on lines 12 through 23, a single quote is for evaluation inside of the program. So if I have a string, right, so a collection of characters, and I want to be able to evaluate what that collection of characters is, I use the single quotes like you see here. In the text, if you were to look on page 49, you would see the record code, and each one of those record codes for A, B, C, other, etc. is represented with a single quote. That's because we're using it inside of the program. The double quotes represent something that is supposed to go out to you as the user. So that's why we don't put double quotes around January, February, March, etc. here. Moving on, we have another set of colons there. And we have season equals winter. So that is the action that we're undertaking. So season equals winter, season equals spring, yada, yada, yada. That lets us know that, contained on this particular line is all of the action that is going to be undertaken by this particular case structure. When we're done with that case, remember to use the end case keyword again. And now when we display the month of this season is, and then we get season over here. So that is terrible English that's happening in here, right? The month is the season. If we were to include this as part of what we are handing off to the next developer in the chain. This is not good because they are going to develop that month is the season. So that's not good. Let's change this so that the language is a little more clear. Is how about that month is in the season. That way we say that month is in the season winter, or that month is in the season summer, and that makes a ton more sense for the next developer in the chain. So is there any real difference between a nested linear if, as represented here, or a case structure as represented here? No. They accomplish exactly the same thing. The only real difference is the case structure accomplishes this in 24 lines. The nested linear if structure accomplishes this in 59 lines. So that's a huge reduction in the amount of code. Anything you can do to reduce the amount of code reduces the amount of errors. Anything that you can do to reduce the amount of errors increases the probability of a good interaction. So where you have a particularly lengthy nested linear if, consider using the case of structure instead.